So for today's movie review, I'll be reviewing the sequel to 2017's Wonder Woman with Wonder Woman 1984, the overall ninth installment of the DC Extended Universe. And as for the production of this movie, with the 2017 Wonder Woman movie being both a critical and box office success, Warner Brothers decided to greenlit a movie sequel immediately with Patty Jenkins and Gal Gadot returning for the movie. And production began on June 2018 and wrapped up around December 2018, but after an initial test screen which resulted in the movie getting mixed reception, there were additional reshoots done in July of 2019, delaying the movie. And keep in mind, this was before the COVID-19 pandemic of 2020 ever showed its ugly face. And 1 month later, the movie was complete, and all Warner Bros. Had to do was wait for the proper time to release the movie theatrically. Then the 2020 pandemic happened, forcing the studio to delay Wonder Woman 1984, because originally it was supposed to have a wide theatrical release on June 5th of 2020, but after being delayed multiple times due to the pandemic, Wonder Woman 1984 finally got released both theatrically and on HBO Max on December 25th of 2020. And upon its release, the movie got a rather mixed to more infamous reception among movie-going audiences, because when the movie came out, it was hailed as not only the worst installment of the DCEU, but also one of the worst movies to come out of 2020, along with being one of the worst comic book movies ever made. And to that I say, really? Was Wonder Woman 1984 really that bad? As for the plot of the movie, sometime after World War I with the defeat of the god of war Ares, Princess Diana, while carrying out her duties as being Wonder Woman, tries to stay under the radar by working as an archaeologist in a Smithsonian museum. While working there, she, along with one of her colleagues and a power-hungry businessman, come across a stone that grants wishes, resulting in Diana getting her wish that her love, Steve Trevor, was back from the dead, her colleague being more like Diana herself, with the unintentional benefit of gaining her superpowers, and the businessman becoming the physical embodiment of the stone itself, who intends to use his newfound power for some greedy purposes. But along the way, chaos ensues, and now it's up to Diana and Steve Trevor to save the world once again. Now, in terms of what I liked about this movie, I liked the overall tone of the movie in terms of how campy it is. Because if I had to compare the tone of this movie, I put it in the same ballpark as the Sam Raimi Spider-Man movies, where it's campy, but it's done so intentionally. Case in point, just look at the way the mall action scene plays out in terms of the way it's edited, paced, and acted. It's very reminiscent to a Sam Raimi Spider-Man movie. Think I'm crazy? Just think back to the moments in the Sam Raimi Spider-Man trilogy where it focuses on a very miscellaneous character for 5 to 10 seconds, but when we do get focused on them, they give such an over-the-top performance for that short amount of time. You remember them. Everything from the pizza boss to the one guy who yells, "Hey, that guy stole that guy's pizza," to the woman who screams at the camera during Dr. Octopus's rampage. You can find very similar tidbits of acting in this movie with some of the minor characters, such as the crook yelling "no" during that mall scene, as I mentioned earlier. Or another example of this movie really pushing for that intentionally campy tone is that one moment during the Cairo chase scene where you have Wonder Woman running at the camera. The special effects used during that scene are very hokey, but I feel like it was meant to be hokey on purpose. Another aspect of the movie I liked is the setting, that being the 1980s. And this is something I find fascinating because at the time of this movie's release, depending on who you were, there were a lot of people who had problems with the fact that the movie was set in the 80s, but for two completely different reasons. Because you had the first camp of people who were frustrated at the fact that the movie was set in the 80s, with the criticism being that the movie overindulged in the 1980s, given that Hollywood for the past decade has been producing a lot of content that would fall into the 1980s nostalgisploitation genre. Then you have the other camp of people whose big criticism revolving around the 1980s setting was the fact that despite having a movie set in the 80s, it didn't take full advantage of the fact that it was set in the 1980s. And this really confused confused me. Because the further I watched some of these reviews, that's all it came down to. They either overindulged or underindulged. And I started wondering, how is it possible for this movie to overindulge or underindulge in the 1980s? Personally, I think this movie just hit the sweet spot in terms of how it presents the 1980s setting. In that sense where, yes, it does overindulge some aspects of the 1980s, at least the stereotypical aspects in terms of the clothing, the neon colors, and the musical choices, but at the same time, it doesn't overindulge in those aspects. It knows when to pull back. And on top of that, I also do like how this movie presents a darker side to the 1980s aesthetic, which is something that a lot of these 1980s nostalgia-exploitation movies don't really do all that much. Most of them just indulge in the stereotypical aspects without really showing the darker nature of that time period, which I thought was really refreshing, given that when you watch a lot of these movies that are a part of the 1980s nostalgia-exploitation genre, most of them just choose to indulge in the more stereotypical aspects of the 1980s setting and nothing else. At least with this movie, I do appreciate the fact that the filmmakers were trying to add some darker commentary showcasing that, hey, the 1980s wasn't always bright and colorful. Another aspect of the movie I really enjoyed is how this movie handles the fish out of water element in this movie. Because in the first movie, the whole story from Diana's perspective is a fish out of water story in that sense where you have this character who grew up on an island and knows nothing of the world of man, and then you have Steve Trevor showing her the world of man. Whereas in this movie, I like how they reverse the roles, and it's Steve Trevor who's the fish out of water, and you have Diana showing him the current world, which is something that I can appreciate. Because yes, it does retread a certain plot point from the first movie, but at least it goes in a different direction with it, which is something that a lot of movie sequels do, where they just retread plot points and do the exact same thing, instead of taking the same plot point but going in a different direction with it. Another aspect of the movie I really liked is the soundtrack. Since it's composed by Hans Zimmer, who I like very much as a composer, and while I will admit, I think he's produced better music in other movies, I still think the soundtrack he produced for this movie, I still think is very good. In that sense where when you do listen to it, it has this positive energy to it, which I think makes a lot of sense given that the movie is set in the 1980s and has a more campier tone. So having a soundtrack that's more positive makes sense in that regard. I even like how the soundtrack incorporates notes of Wonder Woman's theme, but adds a happier, wholesome spin to it. Actually, the more I think about it, I think out of any soundtrack Hans Zimmer has composed, I think this soundtrack in particular is the most, I don't know how else to describe it, but happiest I've ever heard him produce. Another aspect of the movie I really liked is the overall visual aesthetic, because much like I said when I was talking about the 1980s setting, I do like how this movie is very bright and colorful, especially in comparison to the previous Wonder Woman movie, where for the first third it's got a lot of gorgeous colors, but they're very down to earth and more naturalistic, and for the last 2/3 of the movie it's very somber, showcasing a lot of different shades of gray, with the exception of Diana's Wonder Woman costume when we do see her wearing it during the No Man's Land sequence. But even then, the colors to her outfit, although brighter than her environment, are still on the darker side, whereas the color palette in this movie is just drenched in these bright neon colors. Even when you're looking at an object or a piece of clothing that's drenched in some neutral colors, such as your various shades of black, whites, or grays, they have that neon tinge to them that makes them look a lot brighter than normal. And Wonder Woman's costume from a visual aesthetic is also very bright and colorful to look at. And I actually like it here than the way it was presented in the original movie. Another aspect of the movie I liked is kind of hilarious, because one of my biggest problems with the first Wonder Woman movie was that during a lot of the action scenes, with the exception of the No Man's Land action sequence, I thought a lot of the action had a lot of unnecessary slow-mo moments. But with this movie, there are definitely some action scenes that have a lot of slow-mo in them, but the way they're used here I thought was very appropriate, given that so much is happening that you kind of need the slow-mo to see what's going on. Unlike the action scenes in the first Wonder Woman movie, where I could follow what was happening to a point where I don't think it was necessary for those scenes to be in slow-mo. But for some of the action scenes in this movie, such as the point where you see Diana grabbing a dude's gun, unload it, and then you see the bullet flap in the air, and then you see her hit the bullet with her armband, firing it, that I thought needed to be in slow-mo. And speaking of the action, I actually thought the action in this movie was a much bigger improvement over the action from the first movie. Whereas the first movie, I thought the action was just alright, but the action here, there was a lot more flair to the fight choreography, even though I do have a problem with it, which I'll address later. But as far as the actual action scenes are concerned, I thought most of them were really fun to watch. Especially the Cairo chase scene where you have Diana and Steve Trevor chasing Max Lord in his convoy. Because the actual action scene itself, to me, felt very reminiscent to that of a lot of the action scenes you see in the first and third Indiana Jones movies, where you have characters constantly fighting in or around vehicles. And I actually thought the big fight at the very end of the movie was an improvement over the climax of the first one, because my thoughts on the original climax of the first Wonder Woman movie, where you have Wonder Woman battling Ares, I did not like very much, because as I described it, it is just a CGI fuckfest. Because the climax of the movie not only had a lot of CGI being used during that fight scene, but it also didn't look very good. Whereas that climax in this movie, where you have Wonder Woman fighting Cheetah, sure, the CGI in some scenes here and there are a little wonky, but it's not as overblown as the CGI used in the first Wonder Woman movie. And I also like the fact that the fight between Wonder Woman and Cheetah in this movie is more small scale, which I thought was refreshing, given that a lot of superhero movies in the past decade have been very larger than life. And speaking of Cheetah, I also love the inclusion of Cheetah in this movie in terms of how she was handled, which I think is really hilarious, given that, again, if you saw a lot of movie reviews for this movie around the time it was released, one of people's biggest problems with the movie was that most people didn't think Cheetah needed to be in the movie. And while I do have my fair share of problems with the character, I'll address those later. But one of the big criticisms people had with Cheetah in this movie was that, oh, she's just yet another Jim Carrey Riddler or Jamie Foxx Electro archetype, or they're a socially awkward nerd who tries to be friends with the main character but then turns into a villain afterwards. But here's the way I view the whole nerd turned into supervillain archetype for this movie. Jim Carrey's Riddler rolled so that Jamie Foxx's Electro could crawl, and while Jamie Foxx's Electro was crawling, this led to Kirsten Wiig's Cheetah allowing her to run. And why I think she succeeds where those two villains fail. For the first 2/3 of this movie, she's at least a friend and ally to Diana, but within those first 2/3, you slowly start to see her becoming a villain. And by the time you get to the last third, she has embraced the role of the villain, getting into a conflict with Diana. Because the problems with Jim Carrey's Riddler or Jamie Foxx's Electro are that within the first act, they try to be friends with the main hero in some shape or form, but the connection is not there to begin with, which leads them to become a villain immediately, fighting the main hero for the last 2/3 of the movie. At least with this movie, there's more emotional resonance between Diana and Barbara. And on top of that, for those first 2/3, Barbara's just not hanging in the background. She's actually helping out Diana as she's going after Max Lord. And as I mentioned earlier, by the time you do get to the last third and Barbara does become an enemy to Diana, you see the emotional turmoil between Barbara and Diana in terms of how their friendship crumbled at that exact moment. Again, I do have my fair share of problems with Barbara Minerva becoming Cheetah, but I'll talk about that later in the review. But the main takeaway is that Cheetah in this movie is the nerd-turned-supervillain archetype done not perfectly, but is by far the best example of this archetype done right. And another aspect of the movie I liked is the core dynamic between Diana and Max Lord, because the relationship between these two kind of ties into the movie's overall, I don't want to say theme, but dynamic, that being the relationship between truth and lies, whereas Diana is the physical embodiment of truth itself. because she's an archaeologist who possesses the lasso of truth, a magical item that compels men to tell the truth. And on top of that, Diana is someone who acknowledges that in order to obtain something, it has to be earned through hard work, with no shortcuts. Whereas Max Lord, on the other hand, is meant to be the physical embodiment of lies, given that he is a con man who is empowered by the Dreamstone, a magical item created by Dolos, the Duke of Deception, who lives by the philosophy of you don't need to work hard to obtain something. All you need to do is simply want it, by taking the shortcut in order to obtain the thing you want most. After all, the lies are always appealing because they tell us what we want to hear, but the truth is the truth. And no amount of lies will ever change the truth. Because the more lies you tell, the more problems you're gonna cause. Whereas the truth, as painful as it might be, is something you just have to accept. Which plays into the ending of the movie where Diana uses the lasso of truth to essentially communicate her message through Max Lord, telling people to renounce their wish in order to prevent catastrophe. Now, as for an aspect of the movie I had mixed feelings on, let's talk about Max Lord as the villain. Because I'll be honest, I'm not really too familiar with this character. All I know is that he's a recurring friend and foe to Wonder Woman in the Justice League, who's some kind of government agent, if I remember correctly. But aside from that, as far as his depiction in this movie is concerned, he's easily the best part of this entire movie. Everything from the way the character is written, which I'll talk about in a few minutes, to the performance of Pedro Pascal playing Max Lord himself, because you could tell the actor was having a fun time playing this character, because anytime he appears on screen, you just see him chewing the scenery left and right, and it's so delightful to watch. Also, my favorite part with him in it is during the whole Cairo chase scene where Diana lands on the hood of his car, and you just look at his facial expression, it just reads, "What the fuck?" Which is honestly the funniest part of the entire movie for me. That being said, I do have one problem with the character, which is his motivation and actions during the last third of the movie, because for the first 2/3, you understand what his motivation is. He seeks out the Dreamstone in order to save his business. However, by the time you get to the last third of the movie, the character just goes off the rails because he became one of the Dreamstone, granting wishes to everybody around the world. And you sit there thinking, what's his mission again? Wasn't it just to keep his business afloat? Now it just seems like he's just power hungry, willing to give people what they want, unintentionally causing a catastrophe. I just think his writing in the last third of the movie could have been a lot better. And on top of that, I think his story arc in the movie should have had a bittersweet ending to it where, yes, we see him reunited with his son, but it also ends with him getting arrested by the police. I think that would have been a better way to handle the character in some shape or form. But other than that, I thought he was easily the best part of the movie. Now, as for another aspect of the movie I have mixed feelings on, is, hilariously enough, the Amazonian Olympics. Because if you ever paid attention to enough movie reviews from that time period when this movie first came out, the one aspect of this movie that was universally panned by both critics and movie-going audiences at the time was the opening sequence with the Amazonian Olympics, where a lot of people say that it served so little purpose in the movie to a point that you could have removed it altogether and nothing would have changed. Now, sure, I myself am not a big fan of this opening sequence neither, because it has the same problem that the opening sequence to Man of Steel has, where here's a scene that goes on way longer than it needed to. No joke, the Amazonian Olympic prologue in this movie takes up the first 15 minutes, and I don't think it needed to. It could have been a little shorter. However, contrary to popular belief, I actually think the opening prologue to this movie serves not one, but two purposes in this entire movie. First purpose, it's meant to showcase contrast in terms of how much Diana has grown up from being a small child to a mature woman. As for the second purpose of this prologue, it establishes the main theme of the movie, which at its core is about the relationship between the truth and lies, which is something that I already talked about several minutes ago, so I'm not going to repeat that critique all over again. But the point I'm making here is, I understood the purpose behind the prologue, I just think it should have been shorter. Now, in terms of what I disliked about the movie, the pacing is all over the place, because the first 15 minutes of the movie are taken up by the Amazonian Olympic Games. Then the 5 minutes after that, we have that montage of Diana being Wonder Woman saving the day, and this is literally the only time she's Wonder Woman until the hour and 15-minute mark of the movie. In between that, she's not really doing anything. It's just her living her life, interacting with a couple characters which are important to the narrative, but again, it just happens at a very slow pace. Then at the 45-minute mark, Steve Trevor shows up. I don't know, I just think the writing, in terms of how certain things happen, should have been tighter. Then again, the movie could have been shorter too, because the movie is longer than it needed to be, clocking at 2.5 hours. I think there's a few things that could have been removed that could have improved the pacing of the movie, among other things. Sure, once you have Diana and Steve trying to hunt down Max Lord in Cairo, the pacing does get a little better, but it still moves relatively slow. Another problem I have with the movie is the wasted idea of having a movie where Wonder Woman doesn't have any superpowers. Because this movie actually had a cool idea on pen and paper, but they went about it all wrong, because within the context of the movie, between Diana and Barbara both making wishes, results in Diana losing her powers, whereas Barbara gets those powers. And why I think this was such a wasted idea, in my opinion, having this kind of storyline could have been the Spider-Man 2 of Wonder Woman movies, in that sense where, yes, you can have Wonder Woman still be a pre-established character, loses her powers for a good majority of the movie until the last third, kind of like how Peter Parker does in Spider-Man 2. But the problem lies within its execution, because when we do see Diana take up the Wonder Woman mantle around the hour and 10 or 15 minute mark of the movie when she's chasing down Max Lord in Cairo, she still has most of her superpowers. Sure, she gets scratched up here and there, but she still managed to have most of her powers, until her first confrontation with Barbara at the White House, in which she actually gets severely weakened at that point in the movie. Again, going back to what I had about the problems with the movie's pacing, I feel like this kind of thing should have happened way earlier in the movie as opposed to way later. However, unlike Spider-Man 2, Wonder Woman could have gone a very unique direction with Diana not using her superpowers. Because unlike Spider-Man 2, where Peter Parker, when he's having that existential crisis that prevents him from being Spider-Man for a good chunk of the movie, he's just Peter Parker, just some regular dude. Diana, on the other hand, you have to remember, she's not just a demigod, she's also an Amazonian warrior. So you could have had all these opportunities where, yeah, she couldn't use her fast reflexes or her super strength, but she still had the skills of an Amazonian warrior that she could have used to fight her enemies. That would have been really good and unique. This being heavily inspired by the mod era of Wonder Woman, where comic book writers for that time period between the late 60s and early 70s changed Wonder Woman drastically from this superpowered warrior to becoming this woman that became a vigilante that learned martial arts, given the time period where spy movies and martial arts movies were a big thing at the time. But given that this is the 80s, it would go more in the influence of the martial arts angle, since you had movies like The Karate Kid, Big Trouble in Little China, and so forth. So I think having Diana wear essentially a karate outfit with some kind of coloration of her Wonder Woman costume would have been a unique thing to see. Beating up bad guys as a mortal, while Barbara is enjoying the fact that she has this super strength and so forth, and decides to become a vigilante using these superpowers as well, but taking up the mantle of Cheetah, putting on this ridiculous one-piece cheetah suit, referencing the character's early designs where she was just a woman that wore a cheetah one-piece suit. Again, ridiculous, but I think it could have worked. Then, midway through, the two of them find each other, discover their secrets, join forces, beat up some bad guys for a little bit until it's revealed that, oh, in order to undo everything that Max Lord's doing, this would cause a rift between Diana and Barbara, leading to their first fight, having Diana get severely injured while Barbara joins up with Max Lord. And the movie would play out very similar, where Diana would wear that golden eagle armor and confront Barbara for a second time, defeats her, and then when confronting Max Lord, during his wish-granting rampage, he confronts her and goes, "Make the wish and I can bring your boyfriend back from the dead." And before I go any further, yeah, something I probably should have mentioned, Diana never makes the wish to bring Steve Trevor back from the dead. It would just be Barbara making the wish in the first act and not Diana. Even though she thinks it, she doesn't actually go through with the plan. Now, fast forward to how I would end this movie, Diana actually does make a wish with Max Lord, but her wish would go something along the lines of, "I wish Barbara accidentally destroyed the wish-granting stone when she first held it, thus undoing all the events of the movie." So she gets her powers back, Max Lord never becomes one with the stone, the world's back to normal. Then maybe we have a post-credit scene of Barbara looking through all the other artifacts, finding a relic that belongs to the African plant god Urartega, and we essentially hear the voice of Urartega reminding Barbara of the power she once had. Barbara somehow remembers, the two of them converse, Urartega makes an offer. She takes up on the offer, resulting in her transforming into the literal cheetah woman that most people know her as today. And that's how I would have handled the wish-granting stone aspect of the movie, along with some of the character dynamics between Diana and Barbara. Another problem I have with the movie is the advertising for both the posters and the trailers in relation to the color aesthetic and the armor, which I'll talk about in a little bit. Starting with the posters, because when posters for this movie were released, regardless if it's the character posters mainly featuring Diana or the other characters in the movie, the visual motif was bright neon colors, making the movie look as if it was gonna be the Thor Ragnarok of Wonder Woman movies in a visual aesthetic, where it's going to use a lot of those bright neon colors like Thor Ragnarok did. And while this movie is definitely more colorful than the 2017 Wonder Woman movie, it's nowhere near as colorful as those posters were making it out to be. As for the other problem I have with the advertising, has to do with Diana wearing the Golden Eagle armor. Because between the posters that feature her, along with the trailers, you think that Diana wearing this armor is not only going to be a major part of the movie, but you think she's going to be wearing it throughout the course of the movie. But she really doesn't. Or when she does, she only wears it for about 10 minutes of a 2.5-hour movie. And the actual armor itself is a tad bit of a joke, because sometime midway through the movie, we see Diana telling Steve the history of what this armor is, where it's supposedly this really strong armor that this one Amazon warrior wore that held back an entire army, demonstrating just how strong the actual armor is. Yet the moment in which we see Diana wearing the eagle armor confronting Cheetah, the armor gets severely damaged over the course of a few minutes. Just so much buildup for a piece of equipment that gets damaged fairly easy. Another problem that I have with the movie has to do with the continuity this has with other installments of the DCEU. Because when you watch Man of Steel, you're under the impression that when General Zod came to invade Earth, that was the first time mankind as a whole ever experienced anything weird in their lives. Now, sure, with a movie like the 2017 Wonder Woman movie, yes, you have Wonder Woman taking part in World War I, but at least all the stuff revolved around her involvement in that war was either covered up, either purposely or by accident, which actually made sense. But then you get to this movie, which occurs sometime before Man of Steel, and all of this weird shit happens around the world. Yet, characters in other installments of the DCEU that occur sometime after the events of this movie have no memory of it? That is just poor continuity right there. Then again, the more I think about it, I think the DCEU as it sits in some ways has become the new X-Men movie franchise in that sense where the early installments, despite some of the problems they had, were at least able to maintain one type of continuity, but as the franchise progressed, it started messing with the continuity in a way that became inconsistent after a while. I think the same thing is happening with this franchise. Another problem that I had with the movie has to do with the action scenes themselves. Because with the action scenes from the first Wonder Woman movie, on top of relying on her super strength, she mainly fought with a combination of her fists, bracelets, but mainly used a sword and shield combination to fight off the Germans. Sure, she did periodically use the lasso of truth, but she mainly used the sword and shield. As for most of the action scenes in this movie, however, I do not know why the filmmakers decided to do this, but almost every single action scene in this entire movie has her relying way too much on the lasso of truth. In some situations it worked fine, but it felt like she used the lasso of truth way too much in certain instances, especially her fight with Barbara at the White House. She was just using the lasso against her and it did nothing. Sure, she technically gets into a fist fight with her, but only for a few moments until she gets beaten by Barbara. And after a while, you just get bored of her using the lasso of truth to fight off her foes. Now, I understand why she relies heavily on the lasso of truth during the second half of the movie, given that she's losing her powers, but still, I think she could have switched up going back and forth between the lasso and using her fists to fight her foes a bit more. With the exceptions of the Cairo chase along with the big fight between Diana and Barbara later in the movie, I didn't think this movie had any good action scenes in it whatsoever. Another problem that I have with the movie, honestly, this movie has a lot of stupid moments to a point that the rest of this review could just be me pointing out every single stupid moment that occurs throughout the movie, but I'm going to keep it short and point to maybe the stupidest moment in the entire movie, that being the invisible jet, for two reasons. Reason number one, despite Steve Trevor dying in World War I, he is somehow able to fly a jet that was made and built during the 1980s, even though he has no real experience of flying those kind of planes. Second, the whole situation revolving around Diana using her demigod powers to make the plane invisible is just mind-boggling, because it's just a case where this is literally the first and only time she ever uses the ability in the entire movie. Now sure, it does give us some world building in regards to how Zeus was able to hide Themyscira, but still, I wish there was a little more foreshadowing to this moment, and I do wish that she did use this power throughout the movie as opposed to just this one moment. And for my second example of there being a stupid moment, there's quite literally a moment where Steve has Max Lord cornered. And you get that tidbit where Max Lord is like, hey, you wish to be a real boy. I started thinking, okay, even though Steve Trevor knows the risk behind the wish granting stone, why didn't he make a wish that would have undone everything? It feels like it would have improved upon the situation a lot better, but instead he just handcuffs himself to Max Lord so that he doesn't escape his clutches, even though that's exactly what ends up happening anyways. And speaking of Steve Trevor, for the final problem that I have with the movie has to do with Steve Trevor himself, because even though I do think Chris Pine does a good job of reprising this character from the 2017 Wonder Woman movie, and even though I did enjoy his performance within the context of the movie, I just think it was one of those cases where I didn't think the movie needed to have him in it. Not because of the controversy surrounding the idea that he's taken over someone else's body and you have the points in time where he makes out with Diana, resulted in the controversy that Diana is technically making out with someone against their will, resulted in many people claiming that the movie does not address this, which, contrary to popular belief, I actually do think the movie does address this, but it is one of those cases where it's one of those blink and you miss it kind of deals, because the moment I'm thinking of is right as Steve is attempting to make out with Diana in the bed, she says something to him like, okay, we need to go back to the museum to figure out how my dead boyfriend took over someone else's body. And when you really listen to her tone of voice, she sounded kind of concerned at that moment. But it was only for that moment, so I actually do understand where that particular criticism comes from. So what would I have done differently? Personally, even though I did enjoy Steve Trevor in this movie, I didn't think he needed to return in order for this movie to work. Because going back to what I was saying earlier, I actually think that Diana should have had a romantic relationship with Barbara of all people. Because depending on who's writing for Wonder Woman, it is established that Diana is bisexual, so that could have been a different side of the character the filmmakers could have explored. And this also would have made for an interesting relationship between our hero and one of the main villains of the movie. It also would have been a good way to explore the LGBTQ aspect of the 1980s, given that during this time period, it wasn't exactly illegal to be gay, but it wasn't easy to be gay neither during this time period. So I feel like this was something that they could have showcased through this relationship, but I felt this was kind of a missed opportunity in that regard. So for my final verdict of Wonder Woman 1984, while I was entertained by the movie in the same way I am entertained by the Sam Raimi Spider-Man movies, I will admit this movie is severely flawed with its narrative. That said, despite the criticisms I have of the movie, I really don't think it's as bad as everybody else makes it out to be. First off, it's not the worst movie from 2020. If anything, I thought this was one of the better movies to come out of 2020. Second, Birds of Prey is still the worst movie of the DCEU, whereas this movie I think is just mid-tier in my opinion. Thirdly, and most importantly, Wonder Woman 1984 is not the worst comic book movie of all time. Seriously, I've seen my fair share of comic book or superhero-based movies over my lifetime, and I've seen some pretty awful superhero movies. This is not one of them. Overall, Wonder Woman 1984 is a very colorful but average movie. And before I give my final rating, what did everybody else have to say about the movie? As stated earlier, mainly negative reception. And so for my final rating of Wonder Woman 1984, I give it a 3 out of 5. So, out of all of the movies to feature Wonder Woman, regardless if it's live action or animated, which one do you think is the best of the bunch? And see you later.